All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we've got some fascinating sources all pointing to the same thing, the AI race between the U.S. and China.
Definitely seems to be heating up.
Yeah, and we'll be digging into DeepSeek, this Chinese company that's going to come out of nowhere and made a splash in the AI world, and how that set off alarm bells, not just in Silicon Valley, but in Washington, too.
Yeah, their rise has been pretty remarkable.
It really has. So the big question we're exploring today, is this really all about national security, like some claim? Or are there deeper economic anxieties fueling this whole new Cold War?
Right, cause on the surface, that national security angle...
It's been used before.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's get into it. So to set the stage, DeepSeek, this Chinese company, they've developed a large language model that's supposedly even better than the ones from those big names, like OpenAI.
It has been making waves. It's caused a stir, for sure.
And not just a little better. From what we're seeing, it's more powerful, more efficient. And get this, they developed it for way less money than their U.S. counterparts.
Yeah, and to top it all off, they went and released it open source.
Which is just unheard of.
It's definitely a bold move, especially in this climate.
It really is. No wonder people in Silicon Valley are a little on edge.
To say the least, yeah.
Now, the U.S. government's reaction has been pretty interesting. The Navy just straight up banned DeepSeek.
Yeah, that was a pretty clear signal.
Big time. And then there's all this talk about restricting China's access to those advanced semiconductors, the ones you absolutely need for AI development.
All right, essential components.
They're saying it's all about protecting national security, but...
It does feel a little familiar, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
It feels like the same playbook they tried to use against TikTok. And we saw how well that turned out.
Trying to suppress a popular app just leads to something else popping up in its place.
Exactly. And now we're seeing the same kind of strategies being floated around, stealing Chinese engineers, blocking Chinese apps from U.S. app stores. I mean, come on.
The fear is palpable, and it seems to come from a fundamental difference in how they view the economy.
That's a great point. So China's got this socialist market economy, right? They put state-directed investment front and center and prioritize competition in these strategic sectors, especially AI, and it's producing some serious results.
They're pouring resources into AI development, fostering a really dynamic environment where companies are encouraged to innovate and bring those prices down for consumers.
Makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, Peter Thiel was onto something with that whole competition is for losers idea.
Peter Thiel, always good for a provocative take.
Right. I mean, his whole argument is that monopolies are like the natural end game of successful capitalism, and that competition actually eats away at profits and stifles innovation.
And of course, Silicon Valley has really latched on to that.
Big time. And, you know, it's kind of ironic, isn't it? OpenAI is all upset about DeepSeek supposedly using their technology. But didn't they build their models by scraping data from the entire internet?
A little bit hypocritical, wouldn't you say?
It's just a tad. And, you know, Thiel's influence on figures like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance just goes to show how deep this whole monopoly mindset runs in the U.S. tech world.
It's not just some abstract theory. It's shaping actual policies and how the industry responds to anything that looks like a threat to their dominance.
Speaking of threats, let's talk about Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, a U.S. AI company backed by Amazon and Google. No small potatoes there.
Definitely a major player.
He actually published an article urging former President Trump to get even tougher on restrictions against Chinese competitors.
Wow, so he's actively lobbying for a more aggressive stance?
Oh, yeah. He's not mincing words about his goal either. He wants to maintain U.S. global dominance through AI and prevent a bipolar world where China has any kind of comparable technological power.
It's quite a statement coming from someone in his position.
Now, Amodei criticizes China for being aggressive on the world stage, which, you know...
Given the U.S. track record with military interventions and global surveillance...
It's hard not to see the irony there.
A bit of projection, perhaps.
Maybe just a bit. So here they are painting China as the big bad wolf, while pushing for policies that would essentially solidify U.S. technological hegemony.
It raises the question of who's really being aggressive here.
Doesn't it? So if we're piecing all this together, is it possible that all this U.S. aggression towards China is really driven by something deeper? A fear of losing their economic dominance in the face of a rising power with a totally different economic model?
I think that's a very astute observation. This new Cold War might not be about ideology as much as it is about protecting a capitalist model that's frankly struggling to keep up with the efficiency and innovation we're seeing from China.
That's a pretty big claim. So what does that mean for the U.S. if competition really is for losers, like Thiel argues? Then who ends up losing in a world dominated by unchecked monopolies?
Now, that's a question worth pondering. It has some serious implications.
It really does. And it brings us to some uncomfortable truths about the U.S. economic model and how it prioritizes short-term gains over long-term well-being. And that's a topic we'll be digging into in part 2 of this deep dive.
Yeah, it really is something to think about. especially when you consider how the U.S. system is set up. With all that emphasis on shareholder value and quarterly earnings, it's basically built for those short-term gains, often at the expense of long-term innovation. And let's be honest, consumer well-being too.
And you can see that short-term thinking reflected in the prices we're seeing these days. Everything's sky high. Healthcare, education, you name it.
Yeah.
Monopolies are allowed to flourish. They just keep extracting those exorbitant rents. And consumers end up with fewer choices. And a lot of times lower quality products, too.
It's a vicious cycle, for sure. Monopolies lead to higher prices, which then stifle innovation and further consolidate that market power and that economic stagnation. It's a stark contrast to what we're seeing in China's tech sector.
Where they're embracing competition. But within a strategic framework, they're using state-owned banks to give out cheap loans to AI companies, which creates a much more competitive environment where innovation is actually incentivized. So you end up with lower prices and rapid technological advancement.
It's almost like they're taking a cue from classic Marxist theory. They recognize that competition, when managed properly, is actually essential for pushing the boundaries of innovation and ultimately benefiting society as a whole.
And their approach to AI is a perfect example. DeepSeek, releasing their large language model open source. I mean, that's unheard of. They're not just chasing profits. They're aiming for widespread adoption and rapid development. And that open source model, it lets developers around the world build on their technology. It's fostering a collaborative environment that's completely different from those closed, proprietary systems we see in the U.S.
It's very much in line with China's overall economic strategy. It's like building a public park that everyone can use and enjoy.
Yeah, everyone's welcome.
Whereas the U.S. model, it's more like a private club with those hefty membership fees. It's exclusive and limits access to a select few.
What a comparison. It really highlights those fundamental differences in philosophy. China seems to be playing the long game, building that robust ecosystem, while the U.S. is still fixated on squeezing out those short-term profits.
For a handful of shareholders. And we're seeing this play out in other sectors, too. Look at electric vehicles. China's producing EVs at a fraction of the cost compared to their U.S. counterparts. And they're not skimping on quality or features. It's a direct challenge to that whole monopoly pricing and stagnant innovation that's become synonymous with Silicon Valley.
So what happens if the U.S. stays on this path? Protecting those monopolies and suppressing competition, do they risk falling behind in this global tech race?
It's definitely a possibility. And the irony is that by trying so hard to stay on top, they might actually be accelerating their own decline. By clinging to an outdated model, they risk being outmaneuvered and overtaken by a competitor that's more dynamic and adaptable.
It's kind of scary to think about. Makes you wonder, is the U.S. even willing to adapt, to embrace a more competitive approach?
Yeah.
That prioritizes innovation and consumer welfare. Or are they going to keep doubling down on this model that just seems less and less sustainable in the face of a rapidly changing world?
The answer to that question has huge implications, not just for the U.S., but for the entire global economy. If the U.S. continues to prioritize the interests of its corporate monopolies over the well-being of its citizens, they risk more than just economic decline. They risk losing their moral standing on the world stage.
It's a powerful reminder that economic power isn't just about technology or military might. It's about the values a nation embodies and the choices it makes. The U.S. is at a crossroads right now, and the path they choose will determine not only their fate, but potentially the fate of the world.
And it's important to remember the human cost of this tech rivalry, too. Like, this whole push to steal Chinese engineers, it's not just ethically questionable. It shows a zero-sum mentality that's ultimately harmful to progress.
Absolutely. Instead of fostering a collaborative environment where talent can move freely and ideas can be shared, we're seeing a descent into this technological arms race, where one side's gain is automatically the other side's loss. It's that Cold War mentality again, where suspicion and fear are driving policy decisions, often at the expense of common sense and basic human decency.
And in the midst of all this, we can't forget about the other challenges facing humanity: climate change, inequality, pandemics. These are issues that demand global cooperation and a shared sense of purpose. But instead, we're wasting precious resources and energy on this zero-sum game that benefits a tiny fraction of the population.
Makes you think, right? Like, technology is powerful, no doubt, but it's just a tool at the end of the day. And like any tool, it can be used for good or bad.
Right.
So maybe the question we should be asking isn't who wins this tech race, but what kind of future we're trying to build. Do we want a world ruled by fear, dominance, and this relentless pursuit of profit, no matter the cost? Or do we want a future where it's all about collaboration, shared prosperity, and actually making things better for humanity as a whole?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's not just for policymakers or tech CEOs to think about. It's on each of us. We often feel powerless against these global forces, right? But the choices we make every day, the information we consume, the products we buy, the values we embrace, all of that contributes to the world we live in.
This has been a really eye-opening dive into a complicated issue. I think we've uncovered some pretty unsettling truths about the tech industry and how global power really works. But even with all the anxiety and uncertainty, I see a glimmer of hope, too. The fact that we're even having these conversations, questioning the way things are and imagining something different, it means we're not just sitting back and watching this all play out. We have a choice. We have a voice. And we have the power to shape the world we want to live in.
Absolutely. The future isn't set in stone. It's a story we're writing together. One decision, one innovation, one conversation at a time. So as you go about your day, I really encourage you to think critically about the information you come across, the choices you make, and the role you play in this whole rapidly changing tech world. Because the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That wraps up another deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.